heroes. Shakespeare's tragedies, I will talk again a little later about it, are very different from the Greek tragedy which the Europeans already knew about. If I were to talk about the important tragedies, of course, I would mention four. I would talk of Hamlet and Macbeth and Othello and King Lear. Each one of them different, but each one of them so effectively creating the human predicament of not being able to avoid the tragedy that is going to befall them. And these tragedies, my dear students, they do not only affect the character himself, they also affect a lot of other people around them. Because it is like a big oak tree falling. When an oak tree falls, all the other small plants around it are also crushed. So when you have a king, Macbeth, or you have a great hero, a general like Othello, you have a king besotted by love for his fathers, for his daughters as a father, like King Lear. Or you have the Prince of Denmark, Hamlet, confused, procrastinating, not able to decide whether he can take revenge on his uncle, who, according to the ghost of his father, was responsible for murdering him. Not only did Claudius murder the original king, he also married the wife of the slain king, that is his brother's wife. And as we read Hamlet, or as we see Hamlet, my dear students, you must get hold of CDs and watch these movies. Watch great actors like Richard Burton and Laurence Olivier playing some of these roles. And you will see how wonderfully these characters get etched in our memory. But I'm transgressing because I must go on to the next group of plays which are called the historical plays. Let me tell you, even Julius Caesar is about a real king. But in our arrangement of Shakespeare's plays, we put Julius Caesar with the tragedies. And when we talk about the historical plays, we look at plays which are all with the names of kings. Shakespeare was very, very impressed by the Tudors. The Tudor is the dynasty of kings which ruled England. So if you notice at the plays, these are the titles of plays, and I've taken them from the cover of books. And that is why you would notice that all of them are almost of the same size, though of different colors. He was very interested in monarchy. Remember, Queen Elizabeth was ruling, and Queen Elizabeth I was a very strong ruler. It was not yet the kind of parliamentary democracy that you have in England today. So he was very impressed by the dynasty, by the monarchs. And so he wrote historical plays. Well, they are about kings, but in some of the plays there are other characters which come to mind. And when I think of King Henry IV, I can't but remember Falstaff. He is an important character created by Shakespeare. When we look at a play like Henry VI, we can see how important the Tudors were according to Shakespeare. Richard III, to my mind, should be mentioned because the character, the way Shakespeare creates Richard III, is probably showing us how bad a villain can be, how much of treachery can exist in the human mind. So if you read the historical plays, well, maybe a little bit of the background of these kings, the dynasty, the time in which they ruled, the kind of country they ruled. If you have all this, maybe it'll be a little better. But even if you don't, Shakespeare's ability to create the scene is enough for us to be able to appreciate the historical plays. Having talked about the three kinds of plays that he wrote, and my dear students, I'm not going to talk about his poetry because that would need another full lecture. But just to remind you, he also wrote long poems like the rape of Lucrece. He also wrote 154 sonnets, remember, addressed either to the dark lady or to his dear friend, and we are still wondering and still guessing and still having theories about who these two were. But now I have to restrict myself to Shakespeare as a dramatist. So having talked about the three kinds of plays, I would now like to quickly draw your attention to the characteristic features of each one of these. Let us look at the next slide, where we are talking about the features of the comedy. What are the features? They're always young lovers. They have to overcome problems. Yes, and the problems are usually created by the interference of the elders. I'm sure some of you students are saying, nothing has really changed in 400 years. Well, that's what makes Shakespeare a universal dramatist, as important today as he was in his own days. Well, there is also some element of separation and reunification. They come back together. After a lot of troubles, they do come back together. You might like to remember Rosalind and her cousin Celia. You see that also in All's Well That Ends Well. Mistaken identities often involving disguise. So, guessing who it is when he comes in another disguise. That could be also very interesting. A clever servant, a good servant. Family tensions that are usually resolved at the end of the comedy, you would see in As You Like It, for example. Complex interwoven plot lines. Shakespeare believed in not following the three unities of time, place, and action. Remember, Aristotle had talked to us about the importance of the unities, but Shakespeare did not believe in them. And that is why Ben Jonson said Shakespeare is great, but he should not be the model for any dramatist. Well, so the plots are with a subplot. Look at the big tragedies. If you look at King Lear, you would find that. If you look at something like All's Well That Ends Well, if you look at The Tempest, you would always find a subplot along with the main plot. That is what is meant by complex interwoven plot lines. Frequent use of puns and other styles of comedy. He also used language so beautifully in his comedies. Not on thy soul, but on thy soul. What does that mean? Gratiano in The Merchant of Venice, in the court scene when Portia is arguing with Shylock, asking him to show some mercy, for the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from above. It blesses him that gives and him that takes. That's what Portia says. But Shylock the Jew is not impressed, is not convinced, and wants to sharpen the knife with which he can take out his pound of flesh. And then Gratiano, one of the side characters, but Shakespeare gives him such lovely lines when Gratiano says, not on thy soul, but on thy soul. Punning on the word soul. Do you know the two meanings, my dear students? S-O-L-E. So the leather, the sole of a shoe on which he would probably try to sharpen his knife. But Gratiano warns him, Shylock, what are you harming? You are harming your soul. S-O-U-L. So he says, not on thy soul, but on thy soul, dear Jew. Shakespeare's ability to use language to its best use, the maximum play on words. In tragedy, he uses it differently because he uses it seriously. And there, when we talk of tragedy, I'll talk about the imagery that he does. Let's go on to the next slide and look at the main features of the tragedy. All of you have some idea of the main 4 tragedies. By now, I'm sure you have studied at least one of Shakespeare's tragedies. If you have not, time to begin. Well, if you want to know more, I would advise that you should read Tales from Shakespeare by Charles and Mary Lamb. Read it. It's interesting reading. It's written in a language which you're more familiar with because it's not the language of poetry. It's not the language that Shakespeare wrote in. Easy reading. Well, so that you have some idea of the great dramatist and the tragedies that he wrote. Well, what happens in tragedies? What are the major features, the characteristics of Shakespeare's tragedy? Number one, characters become isolated or there is a social breakdown. So if you think of Macbeth, right, he thinks of everyone, probably suspects them, starts believing in what the witches had said. Hail, hail, hail. Thrice they said hail, and 3 times they referred to him with different designations, with different names. One characteristic feature of every tragedy, and I have to say every tragedy that Shakespeare wrote, is that at the end of the play, the hero dies. That's what makes it a tragedy. At the end of Hamlet, in fact, there are so many deaths that one critic said, we have to bring the meat wagon to carry away all these corpses. Laertes, Hamlet, Claudius, the Queen Gertrude, already dead Polonius, Ophelia, the list goes on, Rosencrantz, Guildenstern, it goes on and on. So it ends in death. Why is it different from Greek tragedy? In Greek tragedy, the hero dies because it is his fate. So like you talk about the lines on your forehead, the lines on your palm, or in India, the horoscope, where you were born, where the planets were, etc., etc. So too in Greek tragedy, the hero's death is caused by the signs under which he is born, by the time where he is born. And one of the greatest Greek tragedies to my mind is Oedipus. He could not help but kill his father and marry his mother because it was fated. But as far as Shakespeare is concerned, my dear students, I want to tell you, it's very, very different. How is it different? There is a central figure who is noble. He has a flaw in his character. He has a flaw in his character. That means he causes his own tragedy. If you look at the 4 major tragedies, just as an example, what is Hamlet's flaw? Why should Hamlet die? Because Hamlet has the habit of procrastination. And what is procrastination? It's postponement. Not doing something when it should be done. The number of times that he gets an opportunity to kill Claudius, he wants to kill him, but he doesn't kill him because once he sees him praying, and he says if he kills him when he is praying, he will probably give him an opportunity to reach heaven because at that moment of his death, he was doing something good. So he doesn't kill him. Procrastination leads to Hamlet's death. What about King Lear? Trust. You may well ask me, my dear students, whether trust is wrong. Yes, trust becomes wrong when it is taken to extremes. And what happens in the case of King Lear? He asks his daughters, how much do you love me? And the first 2 daughters, Goneril and Regan, convince him that they love him a great deal. They say all sorts of things, more than gold and silver, more than everything, everything, everything. And what does Cordelia do? The only good daughter, the true honest daughter. And what does she say? I love you as much as a daughter should love a father. King Lear is furious. He thinks that she loves him only because it's her duty to love him, not realizing that she really loves him. So what does he do? He banishes Cordelia and goes to live with Goneril and Regan. I can't tell you the whole story, my dear students, but do go back home or to your library or to one of your Googles and see what really happens to King Lear. So what is his fault? His fault is trust. His flaw, F-L-A-W, is trust. Macbeth, ambition. Julius Caesar, according to Brutus, Julius Caesar also, he had to pay for his ambition. So is ambition wrong? Yes. Ambition becomes wrong if you are willing to walk over corpses just to reach your throne. So Macbeth, because of his ambition, he kills King Duncan along with the connivance of his wife, Lady Macbeth. One of the beautiful characters. I call her beautiful because she's evil, but she's confused evil. And she goes on and on. Not all the perfumes of Arabia can cleanse this hand because she feels the murder, the blood here. And every time she tries to smell her hand, she thinks she can smell the blood of King Duncan. This is the psychology that Shakespeare knew long before Freud appeared on the scene and tried to explain some of our inner feelings, actions which are caused by something that happened long, long ago, maybe in childhood. Othello, the fourth important play of the great tragedies that Shakespeare wrote. And what was Othello's fault? Suspicion. If trust was King Lear's fault when carried to an extreme, here you have suspicion. He was convinced that his wife was cheating on him. And who convinces him? The villain of the play. But he believes it and begins to suspect his wife and smothers her in her own bed. He loved her dearly, but this tragic flaw leads to, first, his killing his wife and then killing himself. In a moment of madness, maybe, he killed her. And then remorse, shock at what he had done, makes him kill himself. Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, think of all the other tragedies that you know. So, all the tragedies end with the death of the main character. Shakespeare, in his plays, did not believe in following any rules. In fact, one critic ironically said that if an English teacher has a red pencil, she would find ever so many mistakes in Shakespeare's plays. Well, that is what we call poetic license. The ability to create, to write in a way which grammarians might not approve of was one of Shakespeare's greatest contribution.